Welcome to HFY Stories. Please subscribe to the channel. Your one click means the world to me. 4:15. The draw call sounded across the Iron Gate quad, and Prenosk was already in the wrong place. She was standing at the edge of the morning draw yard with a map roll under her arm and a borrowed lantern clipped to her collar. And she had been there for 11 minutes because the mapping annex door had been locked from the inside and the facilities desk hadn't opened yet, and she had nowhere else to be. The lantern threw a pale circle onto the stone in front of her boots. Beyond the circle, the draw yard was filling with Vorathi cadets in rank order, and the stone benches were painted in rank band colors she hadn't memorized, and the draw rack stood at the center of the open quad with 51 marked slots glowing amber in the pre-dawn dark. 50 cadets in the yard, each moving to their assigned position without instruction, each placing themselves with the unhurried precision of creatures who had done this every morning for 3 years and understood on some wordless level that the morning draw was not optional. 51 slots. She had counted twice. Not administrative, not a feeding in any practical sense. It was the thing that happened first, before training, before assessment, before any of the day had been earned. The draw call was a heartbeat, and the heartbeat at 4:15, and every Vorathi cadet at Iron Gate Academy was here to answer it. Pren was here because she had gotten turned around in the pre-dawn dark. She had a permit. She had a mapping assignment, update the tactical terrain charts for the northwest approach corridors, which the cadets used for the mid-morning navigation exercises and which hadn't been current since the spring drainage work rerouted the lower seam. The permit was clipped to her collar beneath the lantern. It said, Civilian Cartography Divide Quad Access Restricted Hours Exegated. The mapping annex, where her equipment was stored and her current charts were pinned to the wall in careful sequence, was adjacent to the draw yard. The annex door was locked from the inside. She had knocked twice and received no answer, which she later learned was because the facility's desk worker had wedged it shut with a survey stake on the inside because she was cold and the annex heating ran at half rate until the draw was over. So Pren was standing at the edge of the draw yard with a map roll and a lantern, and the draw was happening around her, and the rack had 51 slots. She kept her back against the low stone wall that separated the yard from the annex approach path. She was not in anyone's way. She was not, technically, in the yard at all. The stone wall was the boundary, and she was on the approach path side of it, which was a corridor, not a yard, and her permit covered quad access. She told herself this. She held the map roll across her chest and kept still and watched. The Vorathi cadets were, she did not have a better word for it, arranged. That was the impression. They had arranged themselves. 50 juveniles of a species that stood, at 3 years of age, at approximately chest height on an adult human, with broad shoulders and dense charcoal fur and pale throat panels that shifted from cream to near white when they were calm. Their ears were wide. Calm, she decided, meant ears fanned forward and out. Wide ears. She watched a pair of them, the second-rank pair, if she was reading the bench paint correctly, walk in step toward the rack, take their portions without ceremony, and return to their bench positions in the same unhurried step they'd arrived with. No fumbling, no rushing. The rack had portions and labeled slots, and each cadet knew which slot was theirs, and the process moved through the ranks from first to last with the kind of absolute quiet that usually meant either deep ritual or something mechanical, and this was not mechanical. In 16 days, she had updated 4 approach corridor charts, spoken to 7 people, eaten most of her meals standing at the annex counter. This was the oldest thing she'd seen since she'd arrived at Iron Gate. She had been at Iron Gate for 16 days. And learned the word for please stand aside in Vorathi body language, because it involved a particular orientation of the leading shoulder that she'd initially misread as aggression. She was not good at reading Vorathi. She was excellent at maps. These were, so far, the 2 defining features of her posting here. The draw moved through the second rank, then the third, then the fourth. Pren had stopped counting. She was watching the last bench, the one at the south end of the yard painted in the lightest band color, which she thought meant either junior rank or training supplemental or possibly both. 3 cubs, the smallest grouping in the yard. They were seated in the compact, tucked posture she'd come to associate with waiting, which in Vorathi apparently meant sitting rather than standing. Haunches down, forelegs braced, ears wide and tracking. Two of them were a similar gray charcoal. The third was darker, almost black at the shoulders, lighter at the throat, noticeably smaller than the other two. The smallest one had its ears oriented away from the rack and toward the stone wall at the yard's south edge, which was Pren's direction, and had been since she'd stopped moving. The draw reached the last bench. 3 slots, 3 cubs. 3 portions, each labeled and sized, small this end of the rack, proportioned for the youngest cadets who were still in developmental growth and didn't yet need adult ration weight. The biggest of the 3 moved first. It took its portion in its mouth, the Vorathi method, clean and direct, not hands, the way a hunting species carries prey, and returned to the bench. The gray charcoal one second, the dark one last. The draw was done. Pren exhaled. She had not noticed she was holding her breath. And then the biggest cub, pale throat, widest shoulders of the 3, ears forward and flat-fanned in a way she now understood meant calm and attending, turned, away from its bench position, away from the morning formation, and walked directly across the open training yard toward the south stone wall. Toward Pren. She put her hand flat on the stone wall behind her. Not bracing, not panic. She told herself it was not panic, just locating the wall. Her other hand went around the map roll. The cub crossed the yard at a walk. Unhurried. The way every Vorathi in this yard did everything, with the specific leisureliness of a creature that has never in its life needed to rush, because it was the thing that other things rushed away from. Pren's hand on the wall tightened. The cub reached the stone boundary, stepped over it without pausing, and set the wrapped portion on the stone ledge beside her right boot. Then it sat down. Stay where you are. What she did with what they gave her, that comes next. It was not looking at her, or not exactly. It had its ears in the wide, attending orientation, and its gaze slightly below direct, which she had learned meant I am not issuing you a challenge. I am simply present. She held the wrapped portion for a moment the way you hold something when you have no idea what to do with it, and putting it down feels worse than standing there holding it. The cub was sitting. And she was very aware of the difference because she had learned it the hard way on day 4 when she'd made sustained eye contact with a senior cadet by accident and a handler had materialized at her elbow in under 6 seconds. She held the portion. Then she held it out toward the cub. "I think this is yours," she said. The cub looked at the portion, then at her. Then it turned its ears slightly forward and tucked its weight more firmly onto its haunches, which she was fairly sure was Vorathi for "I'm comfortable here. Thanks." She continued to hold it out. The cub continued to sit. Across the yard, the second cub, the gray charcoal one, had detached from the bench and was crossing the open quad at the same unhurried walk. It reached the boundary, stepped over, set its portion beside the first one, and sat down approximately half a body length from the first cub. It also did not make direct eye contact with Pren. It also did not leave. Pren looked at the 2 portions beside her boot. She looked at the 2 cubs sitting at measured distance. She looked at the training yard where the senior cadets were still in position at their benches, eating their portions. She looked at the empty bench at the south end. She looked at the dark small one, who was still on the bench watching. "I can't take this," she said to the first cub. Not aggressively, factually. The way she said things when she was trying to establish a shared set of parameters and failing. "This is yours." "I'm not a handler. I'm not. I don't have a slot. See?" She tapped the rack with a gesture, knowing even as she did it that the rack was across the yard and this was entirely symbolic, and the cub probably didn't care about gestures toward racks. "I'm just here for the maps." The cub's ears shifted slightly. She had no idea what that meant. The dark one, smallest of the 3, came across the yard. It moved differently from the other 2, not the unhurried walk, but something more deliberate, more considered, as if it had weighed each footfall and found it acceptable. It reached the boundary. It set its portion beside the other 2, 3 in a row now, like a row of stones on a ledge, and then, instead of sitting at a measured distance, it sat closer, within an arm's reach. Its throat panel was very pale. It looked at the portions, then at Pren. Then at the portions again, the way you look at something you want someone else to see. Pren followed its gaze to the 3 wrapped portions on the stone. She looked back at the small cub. She looked at the 2 cubs sitting a little further back. She looked across the yard, where the senior cadets were finishing, and one handler had looked up from his slate, and one senior cadet had stopped eating and was watching the south boundary with something that was very hard to read at this distance. She held the map roll in her other arm and ate the portion the cubs had carried across a training yard to a person they had no reason to know and set down beside her boot without asking anything. And she tried not to think too hard about what she was doing, because she would either have to give it back, which she'd already tried and failed, or accept it, which felt like taking something she hadn't earned. She picked up the nearest portion. She ate standing up, which was how she always ate when no seat was assigned to her, and she had a deep and practiced aversion to taking things she hadn't earned that dated back to a childhood she didn't think about very often. She ate. The 3 cubs sat at measured distance and watched her finish. She set the map roll across her knees when she sat down on the stone ledge. She'd run out of reasons to stay standing, and the stone was cold but solid, and told herself it was a seat, not a shield. She held it across her lap and ate the second portion, because the first cub had moved slightly closer in a way that suggested the first portion had been accepted, and now it was expecting her to continue, and by the time she'd eaten the second. The map roll was familiar, scuffed at both ends, one tie replaced with a bootlace she'd borrowed from her survey kit and never returned, smelling of the clay she'd used it to carry during the 2 years of terrain postings before this one. The third didn't feel different enough to refuse. She finished. She set the wrappings on the stone. She looked at the 3 cubs. All 3 pairs of ears were forward and wide. She had no data on what this meant following a shared meal. She had no data on any of this. "Thank you," she said. She meant it, which surprised her. She usually only meant things when she'd planned to. The biggest cub, Chalk, she would come to call it, for the pale throat and the way it moved first and furthest blinked once. Then it stood, stepped back over the stone boundary, and walked back to the south bench. The gray one, Dusk, followed at the same measured distance. The small, dark one stayed a half-second longer than the others, looking at the wrappings. Then it followed. Pren sat on the stone ledge with the map roll on her knees and watched 3 cubs return to their bench and seat themselves in position for morning training. She had 37 more terrain charts to update. She was very behind schedule. Across the yard, Senior Assessor Vorn Dale had stopped walking and was looking at his slate. She found out about the flag 4 days later from the facilities desk worker who'd wedged the annex door, who had heard it from a handler, who had heard it from the assessor's office. The phrase was specific and technical and did not, she noted, describe anything that had actually happened. The cubs had not received a transfer order. She had not requested a transfer, and the portions were not, in any practical sense, training materials. Unauthorized transfer of training materials to non-participant civilian. Though she understood why the assessor's office had categorized them that way, because the rack was a training resource and the portions were issued from the rack, and she had no flag in the system. She reported herself the same afternoon. She went to the assessor's outer office and spoke to a clerk and said, "I am the non-participant civilian from the unauthorized transfer incident." The clerk had looked at her, and then at his slate, and then at her again. She gave him her permit number. He found the incident record. He told her to remain available for inquiry, which she did, and then she went back to the annex and pinned chart 7 to the wall and measured the new drainage seam twice because she'd gotten the first measurement wrong and she needed to get the second one right. She arrived before 4:15 now, not to watch, she told herself, but because the annex door was unlocked after the first incident and she could go directly to her charts. The inquiry notice came 3 days after that. In the meantime, the draw happened every morning, and the early start meant she could finish before the cadets used the corridors for navigation exercises. This was logistically true. It was not the whole truth, but she had decided she didn't owe anyone the whole truth about why she started her mornings at a particular time. At the second draw, Chalk oriented toward the mapping annex entrance before the rack opened. She saw it from the annex window. She told herself she had imagined it. At the third draw, all three of them oriented toward the annex entrance before the rack opened. Dusk and Sable were already facing her direction when the draw call sounded. Chalk had his ears forward and flat-fanned, which she'd started to recognize as the particular attention-bearing she associated with him specifically, different from Dusk's broader tracking sweep and Sable's contained, weighted watchfulness. She had named them by the third draw. She hadn't meant to. It had happened the way most things happened to her, through proximity and repetition, until naming them felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement of something already established. She did not bring them food. She was very clear about this with herself. She brought nothing to the draw yard. She did not make eye contact with the handler who stood nearest the south bench, who was a tall Vorathi adult with a secondary marking along the foreleg that she'd come to understand was an Iron Gate service designation. She did not linger at the stone wall. She went to the annex. She worked. She noted the morning draw happening in her peripheral vision through the annex window, and she updated her charts. On day 9, the cubs came to the stone wall without portions. No draw had happened yet. It was 3 minutes before the call. They came across the yard in formation, which she had never seen them do outside of the draw itself, and they sat down at the boundary and oriented toward the annex window. She was holding her measurement tool. She stood at the window and held her measurement tool. The cubs sat at the boundary and waited. The draw call sounded. All three of them turned in the same moment, ears swiveling, and went back to the south bench. Pren set the measurement tool down and looked at the window for a moment. Then she went back to work. The footage review happened on day 11. She knew about it because the inquiry notice had included a secondary addendum she hadn't fully parsed on the first read: behavioral archive data from morning draw sessions to be reviewed by Academy Training Command. She'd assumed this was administrative, a standard protocol check. She hadn't realized it meant someone had sat in a review room and watched 11 mornings of training yard footage and come out with a second flag: reward-seeking behavior towards civilian non-hanger. Then she read the footnote attached to the flag, which explained that the behavioral archive had captured all three cubs consistently orienting toward the non-participant civilian's position during morning sessions. She received the addendum to the inquiry notice at 8:30 in the morning, sitting at her chart table with a cup of cooling tea and a ruler. She read it twice. And that this orientation behavior, when directed toward a non-hander, was categorized as potential handler confusion or accidental reinforcement, and that a reclassification of the Cubs handler assignment protocol was being considered pending the inquiry outcome. She set the notice down. She picked up the ruler and measured a seam on chart 11. She set the ruler down. She wrote a response. The response took her 40 minutes to draft and was, she thought, reasonable, not emotional, not defensive, which she'd worked at, because she felt both of those things and experience had taught her that feeling them in the document was worse than not. She had, in fact, made sustained and deliberate attempts to return the portions, which the Cubs had declined. And she had ultimately accepted the portions because 3 cubs had sat at measured distance and waited, and she had run out of the specific kind of determination required to hold out an unwanted gift while 3 creatures watched her with the patient certainty of things that, she stated, she had given no reward. She had offered no food. She had made no gesture of invitation. Knew they were right. She sent the response. She finished chart 11. The inquiry was scheduled for the following Thursday. On Wednesday, she came back from the water station at the east end of the annex and found that the south bench visible through the annex window had the 3 cubs seated on it an hour before the draw call. They were not doing anything. They were sitting in position. Their ears were tracking the annex window. She stood at the water station with her cup and looked at them through the glass for what was probably longer than was professionally appropriate. The inquiry room was inside the Iron Gate administration building, 1 floor below the training command offices. Then she went to chart 14 and measured a contour line that she'd already measured correctly and noted it was correct and moved on. Thursday came. And it smelled of the same stone and mineral that everything at Iron Gate smelled of, because the entire academy was built into a former mining site and the ventilation system moved air through channels cut from the original survey shafts. The room had a table, 6 chairs, a wall-mounted archive display, and a window that was more of a slit, designed for a different species than human, she noted, and for a different purpose than the provision of natural light. She sat on one side of the table. She had seen him in the training yard. He moved through it in straight lines, which was not a metaphor. He actually took the most direct geometric path between any 2 points he needed to occupy. Vorndale sat on the other. He was compact, precise in movement, in a grease-gray uniform with rank tabs along the left shoulder and a slate in front of him with color-coded markers down the side. And she'd had to step sideways twice in the first week before she understood this was not rudeness, it was efficiency. It was how Vorndale moved through a space he had mentally gridded. He spoke in categories. She had heard him describe a junior handler's performance as adequate in execution, insufficient in theoretical modeling, and he had not been unkind. He had simply reduced the performance to its properties and noted which properties were below the required value. He had never eaten at the morning draw, she'd noticed. He observed it. He evaluated it. He stood at the north boundary with his slate and tracked the cadets through the ritual with the attention of someone taking measurements, and when the draw was over, he made notes and moved to the next scheduled evaluation point. Your portion of the timestamp shows the non-ranked civilian receiving 3 separately issued training ration portions from 3 Vorathi cadets, grade 3, South Bench assignment in sequential transfer. He opened the inquiry by stating the incident parameters. She let him finish. I understand the flag, she said. When he had, I'm disputing the mechanism. The mechanism is documented. He turned his slate toward her. Archive footage. 37 seconds. With the civilian's subsequent consumption confirmed on record. I tried to give the first one back. The attempt is noted. He made a small mark on the slate. It does not change the material outcome. The material outcome is that 3 cadets made a choice I didn't ask for and couldn't prevent. The cadets made a conditioned response to an environmental cue. She looked at him. Which cue, she said. He did not pause. He had clearly thought about this. Your presence in the draw yard at draw time constitutes an environmental stimulus. The cadets, grade 3, youngest current cohort, still in foundational reinforcement, have a documented sensitivity to novel stimuli in familiar contexts. Your presence at the south boundary on the morning in question created an attention anchor. The transfer behavior was a redirected orientation response. The cubs moved toward the novel stimulus and performed a drive state behavior, food transfer, because the stimulus was present during the draw. They bypassed their handler to reach me, Pren said. Handle positioning is tracked independently. He made a second mark. The handler's location relative to the south boundary is a variable, not a factor. The cadets were oriented toward the novel stimulus. Their handler was closer to me than I was. He looked at her. The archive footage shows, she said carefully, all 3 cadets passing the handler who stood between them and the south boundary. She reached into her vest and produced a printout. She had requested the archive clip 3 days ago, had watched it 11 times. She let that sit, had printed a frame-by-frame still of the relevant sequence. She set it on the table. This is the handler. This is his position. This is the distance between his position and the south boundary. The cadets walked past him. He was closer to me than I was to the south boundary wall. They kept walking. Vorndale looked at the printout. He looked at it for a long time. The handler, he said, did not issue a cue. No, Pren agreed. He didn't, and neither did I. Another pause. Longer. The cubs have oriented toward the mapping annex entrance before subsequent draws, she said. Not during draws, before them. Before the rack opens, before the draw call in some cases. This is not a response to a food stimulus because the food isn't present yet. He was looking at the printout. I am not arguing that the behavior is comfortable for the institution, she said. I'm arguing that reward-seeking behavior toward civilian non-hander is the wrong category. A reward-seeking behavior is triggered by the presence of a reward. The reward isn't present in a pre-draw orientation. What's present is me. She could not tell if this was landing. He was very still, in the way people were still when they were thinking hard rather than the way they were still when they'd stopped listening. His slate was on the table. He had not made any more marks. The Vorathi family liaison has been summoned, he said, finally. She will attend the formal panel. When? 2 days. She looked at the window slit. It was morning outside. She had chart 17 waiting. My mapping permit, she said, under provisional review pending the panel outcome. He picked up the slate. You are not restricted from the annex. You are restricted from the draw yard during the review period. She looked at the draw yard through the window slit. She could not see the south bench from this angle. Understood, she said. Tor vessel arrived at Irongate on a Saturday. Pren heard her before she saw her, not because Tor vessel was loud, but because Tor vessel was large, and large things make different sounds when they move through a stone-floored building. The footfall, the particular quality of the air moving ahead of something that displaces a lot of it. She heard those sounds in the annex at 7:30 in the morning, and she set down her measurement tool and went to the annex window, and she saw the Vorathi family liaison crossing the quad from the main gate, broad-shouldered, unhurried. Moving with the same deliberate weight as every Vorathi Pren had observed, but scaled up, this was an adult, a fully grown adult, and the size difference between a Vorathi adult and a Vorathi Grade 3 cadet was substantial. The fur was darker gray, with the pale throat panel deepened to cream. The ears were fully extended and flat-fanned forward, which Pren now understood as the calm and attending orientation in full expression. In an adult, was something closer to, she did not have a word for it. Settled. The word settled came close. Tor vessel moved through the quad as if she had been at Irongate for years and simply hadn't needed to come to this particular building until now. She was carrying nothing. Pren had expected a case, documentation. The kind of material authority that arrives with credentials and evidence. Tor vessel had nothing in her forelegs and nothing over her shoulders and was not, as far as Pren could see, carrying anything. She watched Tor vessel enter the administration building from the annex window. She picked up her measurement tool. She set it down. She looked at the south bench through the window. The 3 cubs were in position. It was Saturday. The draw still happened on Saturdays at Irongate. The academy didn't close for the day cycle. Chalk, dusk, sable, in position, waiting. She had been asked to be present, which she had expected, and told to bring any documentation she wished to submit, which she had, and told that the family liaison would be present in an advisory capacity, which she had not expected. She had not been to the draw yard in 2 days, and they had oriented toward the annex window from the bench anyway. She went back to chart 17. The panel convened at 11, and that the session would be recorded to archive, which she supposed was appropriate. The room had 6 chairs. 2 additional benches had been brought in along one wall, sized for Vorathi. The academy had them, apparently for occasions requiring multi-species seating. Tor vessel sat on one of the benches. Vorndale sat at the center of the table. Pren sat across from him. 2 other members of Irongate Training Command she had not met before sat at the ends. A recorder was mounted in the ceiling. Vorndale stated the incident parameters again. He stated the subsequent flags. He used no words she would have disputed, and the shape of what he described was accurate, and it still felt, sitting across the table from him. He stated the behavioral archive findings and the proposed reclassification of the Cubs handler assignment. He was precise and complete. Like being described from the wrong direction, like looking at a map of a terrain, she recognized where all the rivers were correct and all the elevations were correct, and something fundamental about why the place mattered had not made it into the projection. When he finished, one of the other panel members asked Pren if she had anything to add to her prior written statement. "Nothing new," she said. "I think my statement accurately describes what happened." The panel member made a note. Then Vorndale turned to Tor vessel. "You've reviewed the archive footage and the behavioral flags," he said. "From the liaison's perspective, how do you categorize the incident?" Tor vessel was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of hesitation. The silence of someone choosing the order of something that was already decided. "I have 2 questions," she said. Her voice was lower than Pren had expected, not in pitch but in register, a resonance quality that moved through the room differently than human voices did. She did not speak quickly. She did not seem to feel any pressure toward quickness. Yes, said Vorndale, was the human present at the morning draw. The panel member at the left end looked at his notes. Yes. Present at the south boundary during the full draw sequence. Did she receive no portion from the rack? A pause. She has no allotment slot in the draw system. No, she received nothing from the rack. Tor Vessel looked at Pren. Pren looked at Tor Vessel. Then Tor Vessel looked at the panel and said, "Then the Cubs did what the morning draw requires." No one spoke for a moment. Vorndale's slate was in his hand. He had not made a mark. The morning draw, Tor Vessel said, is not a feeding. She said it without emphasis. Without the particular weight people used when they were saying the important thing, she said it the way you say something that has been true for so long it doesn't need weight. A Vorathi cadet receives a portion from the rack. This is not because they are hungry. They eat during the session, yes, but the portion is not the purpose. The purpose is that their name is called, and they receive, and they are seen. The draw is the morning count. It is the group saying, "You are here, and we know you are here." This is what the rack does. This is what it has always done. Vorndale was still. A Vorathi who is present at the draw and receives nothing. Tor Vessel continued, is not invisible. In our tradition, to be present and receive nothing is a gap. It is a deficit. It is the Cub's obligation. It is not a choice. It is not a conditioned response. It is an obligation that comes before training, before rank, before handler assignment, to complete the draw for the person who was overlooked. One of the panel members said, "The group sees someone at the morning count, and that person receives no portion, and the draw is incomplete." Carefully, the human was not a participant in the draw. She was present, Tor Vessel said. In Vorathi tradition, presence at the morning draw is the only qualification for inclusion. Rank is the order of the draw. Rank is not the boundary of the draw. The Cubs did not give the human food. They gave her the morning count. They said, "You are here, and we see you, and the draw is not complete without you." That is the oldest thing we teach. She paused. We teach it before we teach rank, before we teach formation, before we teach anything that Irongate Academy calls training. She was looking at the map roll she'd set across her knees when she sat down. Habit, she'd stopped noticing she did it, and she was thinking about a training yard at 4:15 in the morning and a draw rack with 51 slots and only 50 names. And she was thinking about the extra slot that glowed amber in the pre-dawn dark and had no name on it, and she was thinking about chalk crossing the yard, past the handler, past everyone. Because if the Cubs do not know to complete the count for the person who was overlooked, then nothing else we teach them is worth the space it takes. The room was quiet. Pren was looking at the table. Across the open quad without rushing and setting a wrapped portion on the stone beside her boot and sitting down, she had thought it was a gesture. She had thought it was something the Cubs did because she was unusual, a novel stimulus, something that caught their attention in a familiar yard. She had thought it was, she hadn't let herself think too clearly about what it was, because every version of it that felt true was the kind of thing that seemed too large to carry around and work a 12-hour shift beside. But she had taken the portion and eaten it and said thank you and meant it, and the small dark cub had looked at the wrappings, and she had thought about that look for 11 days without finding a frame it fit into. "You are here, and we see you, and the draw is not complete without you." She kept her hands on the map roll and did not say anything. This was not a moment for her to say anything. This was a moment to hold very still and let the truth of it settle without pushing it the way you let a measurement sit before you write it down. Vorndale set his slate on the table. "The behavioral archive," he said after a moment. "The footage showing the Cubs bypassing the handler." "Yes," said Tor Vessel. The handler stood closer to the south boundary than the human's position. The cadets passed him. The handler had a portion, Tor Vessel said. He had been counted. The human had not. She let that sit for a moment. They were not going to someone who needed training. They were going to someone who needed the draw. Vorndale looked at his slate. He looked at it for a long time, then he picked it up. She had watched the first clip 11 times. She had not seen the subsequent 9 mornings from this angle, the ceiling mount recorder perspective. The archive footage was reviewed again, both clips, all 11 mornings. The room watched, Pren watched, which showed the full yard and the bench positions and the handler positioning for all 3 subsequent orientation before draw incidents. At morning 9, Sable, the small dark one, the last to arrive, the one who stayed half a second longer than the others, crossed the yard boundary and sat within arm's reach of the window for approximately 40 seconds before the pre-draw bell, and then returned to the bench without eating anything, without making any gesture. At morning 4, Chalk's ears turned toward the annex window 3 full minutes before the draw call. At morning 6, all 3 of them were oriented toward the annex before they took their positions on the bench. Without doing anything at all except sitting close for 40 seconds, Pren watched this clip. She watched it twice. The second time she noted that Sable had not looked at the annex window. Sable had looked at the annex door, the door she used every morning. The one she came through at 4:15. Vorn Dale was making marks on his slate. The pre-draw orientation behavior, he said. Presence acknowledgement, said Tor Vessel. In the morning count, you acknowledge that a person has arrived before the draw begins. It is not a separate thing from the draw. It is the draw starting early, because the person is already there. The panel member at the right end cleared his throat. The proposed handler confusion reclassification is incorrect, Tor Vessel said, without heat. The way you say something that is incorrect is incorrect. They are not confused about their handler. They know their handler. They performed the draw for a person their handler is not, and they did it correctly. The panel deliberated in Pren's absence for 40 minutes, which she spent in the annex corridor on a bench that was the wrong height for her, and too cold through her trousers, and she didn't care. She had chart 17 on her knee. She was not looking at chart 17. She was looking at the stone floor. You are here. That was what Chalk had been doing, crossing the yard. You are here, and we see you, and the draw is not complete without you. Not charity, not a gesture. Not, and this was the one she'd least wanted to think about, not an accident, not a conditioning artifact, not a novel stimulus response. An obligation. The oldest obligation the Cubs had been taught before rank, before formation, before anything Iron Gate called training. She was there, and she had nothing, and the draw was incomplete, and they had walked across the yard and completed it. She had tried to give it back. Chalk had sat down and waited. She pressed her hand flat on the cold bench. She had spent most of her adult life in terrain, where her name was not on the rack, and there was no rack and no morning draw and no one was counting. And this was not something she'd lacked. She'd thought it was just the texture of her particular life. She had been at Irongate for 16 days, and she had not thought of herself as someone who was owed a morning count. She had not thought of herself as someone who was missed from one, and her life was useful and had good maps in it, and she was genuinely good at the maps. 3 Grade 3 Vorathi cadets had looked at her across a draw yard and determined that the count was wrong and corrected it. She heard the panel room door open. The unauthorized transfer of training materials to non-participant civilian flag was removed. Vorn Dale was required, per panel recommendation. The reward-seeking behavior towards civilian non-handler flag was removed. The proposed handler confusion reclassification was not submitted. To submit a revised behavioral assessment for the 3 Grade 3 cadets, an assessment that incorporated the Vorathi family liaison's documentation of morning draw tradition and noted the behavioral chain as a documented social practice rather than a conditioning artifact. He was further required to submit this assessment to the Irongate Family Liaison Office for co-review before filing, which meant his sole authority over Vorathi's social behavior incident classification was now shared with the Liaison Office on a going-forward basis. He received this requirement without visible reaction. He wrote it on his slate. He would, Pren thought, comply with it precisely, in his particular way, and the precision would eventually be the point. Pren's mapping permit was restored. A new field was added to the Irongate training record system, voluntary inclusion gesture, non-rank member present at morning draw. The field had no precedent in the existing system architecture. The training records administrator had, apparently, been waiting for a category for this specific behavioral chain for some time and was quietly gratified. Pren signed the panel receipt. She shook hands with the panel member on the right, who had a firm handshake and seemed genuinely glad about the outcome. She looked at Vorn Dale, who looked back at her with the expression of someone running a recalibration in real time and taking it seriously, which she had not expected and respected more than she would have expected too. She gathered her documents and her map roll. She looked at Tor Vessel. Tor Vessel's ears were fully fanned, wide and forward and flat, in the full expression of the attending calm she'd first seen in the draw yard when the cub's ears were wide before the gesture. "The morning count does not require rank," Tor Vessel said. "It requires presence." "Yeah," said Pren. She went back to the annex. She updated Chart 18 in approximately 45 minutes, which was a personal best for that chart size because her hands were steady and her eyes were clear, and she decided, going to be more efficient at everything today. She did not examine why. She measured Chart 19's contour intervals and found 2 of them she'd gotten wrong last week and corrected them. She made tea. She drank it standing up, which was how she always drank tea when she didn't have a reason to sit, which she usually didn't. She had told herself she would stay in the annex and update Chart 20. At 4:15 the following morning, the draw call sounded across the quad. She came to the yard. She had not planned to, which had 3 sections she hadn't touched, and a drainage indicator she'd been avoiding because the indicator was technically outside her remit, and she wasn't sure whether to flag it or absorb it into the mapping notation. She had said this to herself clearly and directly, and she had gotten dressed and put on her boots and clipped her permit to her collar and picked up her map roll and gone to the draw yard. The draw rack had 51 marked slots, 50 glowing amber, 1 not. She had a question forming that she thought she was not going to ask Vorn Dale, because she didn't think Vorn Dale's system had the answer. But she thought she might ask Tor Vessel the next time the liaison was at Iron Gate, which apparently happened quarterly. The slot with no name was at the end, bottom row. The bracket was labeled in Vorathi script she couldn't read, which she'd assumed was an institutional code, a blank, a reserve, an administrative placeholder. She stood at the south boundary with her map roll and looked at it. And she would write it down so she didn't forget. She was still looking at the slot when Chalk arrived. Not from the bench was on the far side of the yard, and the cadets were still assembling. From the approach corridor, where the cadets came in from the housing block, Chalk was moving at the same unhurried walk as always, but arriving earlier than the others, and he crossed the yard directly to the south boundary before going to the bench. He stopped at the boundary. He looked at her. His ears were forward, wide, flat-fanned. "Hi," she said. He turned his ears very slightly inward, which she was beginning to associate with a particular quality of attention that was different from the broad scan and the away track, something more focused, more specific. She did not have a word for it yet. She filed it. He turned and went to the bench. Dusk arrived a minute later and did the same thing, approached the south boundary first, looked at her, turned and went to the bench. She said nothing to Dusk. Then the draw call sounded and the cadets filled the yard, rank order, the ritual proceeding exactly as it had every morning for whatever number of mornings it had proceeded before she arrived at Iron Gate, before she existed, before this particular draw yard existed. Dusk's ear turn was different from Chalk's, broader, sweeping, like taking a measurement, and then it went, moving through the oldest pattern the species had. The draw moved through the ranks. Sable was last to arrive at the south boundary. After the draw call, but before the rack opened, a sliver of time she hadn't known existed in the morning draw sequence until now, a pause, a breath between the call and the first rank moving. Sable came across the yard in that pause and sat at the boundary within arm's reach, the same way it had in the archival footage, and looked at the annex door. Then at Pren. "I'm here," Pren said. Sable's throat panel was very pale. The ears shifted, that inward focused turn, the same one Chalk had, and then it turned and went to the bench. The rack opened. The cadets moved through in rank order. The last bench, south position. 3 small portions, grade 3, the youngest cohort, each taking the smallest portion the rack offered and returning to position. Pren stood at the south boundary with her map roll. The draw finished. The yard held for a moment in the aftermath of the sequence, that particular acoustic quality of a space that has just completed something. 50 cadets. 50 portions taken and acknowledged. The rack closed. And then, without a signal, without a formation prompt, without anything she could see pass between them, all 3 Grade 3 cadets stood, turned from the bench, and crossed the yard toward the south boundary. She already knew she wasn't going to try to give them back. She sat down on the stone ledge, map roll across her knees, and waited for them. The yard was warm from 50 bodies and the rising sun at the east wall. She did it automatically now. The way she'd started coming to the draw yard automatically, the way she'd started arriving before 4:15 automatically. The stone was not cold this morning, or it was, but less so, and she'd brought her heavier vest, which was warmer than the one she'd had on the first morning. She had a second pencil behind her ear. She did not remember putting it there. The way she'd started keeping a small square of blank paper in her left-hand pocket, just in case she needed to write down a measurement while standing somewhere with no other surface to write on. Chalk set the first portion on the stone. He did not sit down immediately this time. He stood for a moment, looking at the annex, then at the map roll on her knees, then at the portion. She looked where he was looking. She unrolled the map roll on the stone beside her and put the portion on the inner edge to hold it open. Chalk sat down. Sable set the third, the dark, small, last-arriving one, who always set its portion last and always stayed closest and always looked at what remained when it was done, as if checking that the count was complete, and then sat, within arm's reach, its throat pale. Dusk set the second portion, sat. Its ears in the focused inward turn, Pren looked at the 3 portions. She looked at the map unrolled on the stone beside her, held open by the weight of a portion she hadn't earned and didn't intend to return. She was working her way through the third when she noticed she had, without thinking about it, moved the pencil from behind her ear to her hand and was making a note on the edge of the map, not a terrain measurement, just a date, just today's date, in the margin. She looked at the draw rack across the yard, standing empty now. 51 slots, one without a name. She ate the first portion. Then the second, which she hadn't done before on any of the 17+ charts she'd worked through at Iron Gate. She looked at it. She decided to leave it. The yard had emptied while she ate. The cadets had moved off to the morning exercise positions, the handlers following, the ritual complete, and the day's training beginning. The draw rack stood unlit, the amber lights off, the slots dark. The north boundary was empty. The benches were empty. The south bench had 3 cubs on it. They had not gone to the morning exercise positions. They were in position on the bench, tucked, waiting, forelegs braced, watching her eat. She thought, Tor Vessel has Irongate's contact information and apparently comes quarterly and probably has a very efficient route from wherever she's stationed and is going to have an opinion about any new flags before they become formal incidents. Across the yard, she saw a handler look at the south bench. Look at her. Make a note on his slate, she thought. That's going to be another flag, she thought. Let it be. She sat for a moment with her hands on her knees, in the warming stone of the south boundary, in the draw yard at Iron Gate Academy, in the day that was beginning around her, the training compounds filling, the navigation corridors activating. The academy moving into the particular morning energy that she'd come to understand as Iron Gate's version of waking up, which was abrupt and precise and started all at once rather than gradually, the way a draw call started all at once rather than gradually. And anyway, the new field in the training record system is probably exactly the right place for whatever this is. She ate the third portion. She rolled the map back up and tied it with the bootless and tucked it under her arm. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, she arrived at the annex at 4:10 to find the annex doorstep empty in a way it shouldn't have been. Because some things were structured to begin fully or not at all. She looked at the south bench. 3 pairs of ears, wide, forward, flat-fanned. I've got 17 more charts, she said. She got up and went to work. Because she'd left her map roll there the night before when she'd stepped out to get the last seam measurement in the northwest corridor before the light went and hadn't needed it for that and set it by the door when she came back in and hadn't retrieved it before locking up. She looked at the doorstep, she looked at the yard. The south bench had 3 cubs on it, which was 4 minutes before the draw call, which was earlier than usual, but not unprecedented anymore. The map roll was on the stone ledge beside them, set upright against the bench's painted rank band so it wouldn't roll. It was exactly where she sat. She walked across the yard. The cubs tracked her approach with ears wide and flat-fanned, but none of them moved from the bench. She reached the stone ledge and looked at the map roll's same bootless tie, scuffed ends, the clay smell she never quite got out of it, and beside it, 3 small wrapped portions, set on the stone before she arrived. The bench was warm from cubs who had come first, sat in her spot to mark it, and moved back to give it to her. She picked up the map roll. She put it across her knees. She put the pencil behind her ear. The draw call sounded at 4:15, and Pren Osk was exactly where she was supposed to be. In the Iron Gate Academy training record system, the new field read, "Voluntary inclusion gesture divided ma non-rank member present at morning draw." It had no name in the slot that would have held one. Tor Vessel, when informed of this, said that was correct. He filed it at pre-dawn alone in a grease-gray uniform with every rank tab in the correct position, moving through the administration building in a straight line from the door to his office to the archive terminal, precise and complete. The morning count, she explained, didn't require a name in the system. It only required someone at the draw who saw you and knew you were there. Vorndale made a note of this in the revised behavioral assessment. Adding the last field to the last document before the draw call sounded across the quad. He was not there when it sounded. He was already at the north boundary with his slate, observing, evaluating, measuring. And in the morning draw yard, on the stone bench at the south end, a cartography assistant had her map unrolled on her knee and a pencil in her hand, and 3 portions were set beside her, and the bench was warm, and the yard was assembling for another draw.